So I'm trained as an architectural historian, and I have an undergrad degree in architecture. So I did do studio, which I feel like is important to kind of get out there. And I'm also an architecture critic. I mean, I write, sort of more occasionally now for magazines and newspapers. I write books about architecture. I just wrote this book about architecture. And I teach. And then I have this, until now, very secret career as a sort of very high-end architectural publicist. And what that means is that I work with architects and designers on publishing their projects. And I sort of play, as long a game as possible. I see myself as kind of a steward of people's reputation, of people's career. And I don't do business development. I don't do, client acquisition, but I am really, really targeted on working with them on what kind of images are published and what kind of stories are published about them. So I worked with, photographer Joe Fletcher introduced us. He and I have collaborated a lot on placing projects. So that's sort of my day job among many day jobs.
So why a secret career in this field?
So there's sort of two reasons. So one is that when I started as a writer in 2003, there was a very clear separation of, church and state. So publicists were over here and writers were over here.
Right.
And the writers were all very envious because we would get paid, $800 to $1,000 to write a story. And there were sort of these legendary fees that we heard about publicists commanding. So one story that I heard, which I'm sure is not true, was I wrote a piece for Wallpaper magazine about a big luxury development. I got paid, $1,000. And I heard later that the publicist got paid $50,000 to place that story. Right. Mm-hmm. I don't know if this is true. Again, this is just the kind of gossip that kind of went around. But the point is there was kind of, envy on the part of writers, but also this feeling of almost purity or mm-hmm. we the writers, we were just devoted to the best criticism we could do. And of course we're accepting free press trips and, this was in the extravagant aughts. So we weren't really as pure as we were saying, but there was a very strong divide. And if you were on the publicist side, you'd sort of sold out. And if you were on the writer side, you were, immaculate in some way. And so that kind of stuck with me in a way. And when I first started doing publicity, I remember sort of feeling a little bit insecure about it, or I'd write to my editor contacts and I'd say, well, things are different. I'm not in my 20s anymore. I need to pay the bills.
Right.
And, sort of trying to say I'm not really, I know that
went to the
I
dark
see what
side.
I'm doing. Don't worry. Exactly. I went to the dark side. And nobody cared because in the intervening 20 years, the economy has changed completely. Our understanding of people needing to work for a living has changed completely. There's a lot less shame around needing to do that. So that was sort of one reason, is just this a little bit of oh, do I want people to know I went to the dark side? So that's sort of the personal work that out in therapy reason. The other reason is really a professional reason, which is that I want my clients to appear as though they have earned every single piece of press that they got solely through merit, mm-hmm. right?
Sure.
And so I'm part of creating this sort of smokescreen, which, and a lot of this is what my book is about, is sort of this idea that architecture critics, architectural consumers, potential clients have this sort of belief in the media that if you are an architect and you're published in the New York Times, it's because the New York Times discovered you, mm-hmm. plucked you out of obscurity, and is choosing to highlight your work over the work of thousands of other, potential subjects. And how you really get published in the New York Times is, usually somebody hires a publicist and the publicist pitches the editor and sort of facilitates everything. And so I still want to maintain that myth for my clients, So again, this book is a little bit the joke I was saying is I might never work in this town again, because I sort of lay out exactly how the media ecosystem actually works. I lay out my part in it. And I don't critique it. I think it's fine. I think it's completely fine that this ecosystem exists. But it does exist. And I'm trying to sort of really play both sides by writing this book saying, everybody look at how it works, and then also completely participating in how it works and benefiting from that.
Yeah.
So that's my like moral tension to live with.
I feel like you should sleep easy at night because that is the way things are, and that is the way it works. Whether or not we like it or don't like it, the machine is very much in place.
Exactly. Yeah. And I realize, I mean, thank you for that. I'm glad that you agree. And I think just describing the machine felt like such a sort of interesting process. But, you know, the last thing I'll say about being secret is I've noticed that, you know, there are a lot of publicists who will say, you know, look, I got this press from my clients, like on Instagram, they'll say recent press that I got from my clients. And I might be alone in this, but I always sort of feel like it's just slightly devalues the press, you know, when you say like, look what I got for you. So it really, I would say like 80% of my motivation is for my clients and 20% is the like, can I sleep at night? Am I on the dark side? Am I, you know?
Yeah. It's an interesting thing on that last point, because for publicists, they also you presume need to go out and get their own clients and want to be appealing. And the way they would do that, you would assume, is what you just said, which is somewhat at odds with the whole gig.
Yeah, it can be hard for me to close a client because they're like, okay, well, I Googled you and you're a writer and you live in New York. And then I say, well, it's on purpose. And, you know, the name of my company is, the name of the company is blank product, which is like ungoogleable, which is on purpose. Really cool. And and thank you. And I don't have a website, and they're like, okay, well, who do you work with? And I say, well, I keep my client list private. And they're just like, and so I just say, you know, I've recently been, you know, I've provided referrals where I'm like, okay, if you're really like interested, you know, you can talk to one of my clients. But that's why people like Joe are really instrumental. Well, Joe will recommend me to somebody and he'll just say like, you just kind of have to trust her. And I've learned that I say like, you know, it's going to take 3 to 6 months before you see anything, but yeah, it takes a lot of faith on behalf of my clients because there's absolutely no evidence anywhere that's public that I'm good at my job.
So I guess for you, it's...
And I keep it that way, so...
Yeah. So what are you complaining about then?
Genius.
No,
Totally.
So you really, in your space, with the publicity aspect of it, it's really about the relationships. Yeah. I want to talk about how you end up in your current position. Oh, real quick. So kind of a distinction, which might be obvious to people, I don't know, but between the journalists and the publicists. So the publicists are sort of like lobbyists in a sense. I mean, is that their main value that they bring is just introducing you or introducing your work or whatever to other people? Is that the main value?
Basically, yeah. I mean, I think that's sort of the primary value. I mean, I think another secondary or equal value is in how the client's work is represented. So architects, generally, I'm going to totally generalize here, they don't really have a super strong sense of a narrative, right? So they'll say, oh, I did this house. I did it for a couple. They have a dog. And it was a really fun project. Right. And they'll try to pitch a project with that description. And I'll say, that's very interesting. That's great. But let's actually talk about, you know, I had this one example. I had a client who did a really, really amazing renovation in Orinda that was on the cover of Dwell. And I did a sort of practice interview with him before he was going to talk to the Dwell writer. And I said, tell me the most interesting thing about the project. And he said, well, the gray water reclamation system and the way that we're reusing, you know, dishwasher liquid for the toilets. And I was like, okay, you can't lead with that, right? You can't start with that. Tell me, you know, generally about we start talking. He starts telling me this amazing story about this tree, and he would sit underneath the tree and he would remember being a boy. And looking at trees, and he really thought about the tree in the house. And I was like, okay, that's a narrative, right? That's a story. And so I think even more than the introductions, which is really, really essential, is really helping architects and designers start to articulate and find, like, what is the propulsive narrative behind their project? What is driving them? What was an interesting moment where they, I always ask this question. I say, what was the moment where all hope was lost? And then what was the moment where all hope was found again, right? Because with every project, there's a moment where you're like, oh my God, I did the wrong kind of concrete, or I have the wrong rebar, or I put the house in the wrong place, or the contractor is suing me, or whatever. And I sort of help them formulate that into what can become kind of a linear narrative that is fun to read, right? Because you want somebody, a potential client, to read a story in the New York Times or read a story in Dwell and be like, this architect is really cool. They're really smart. They're really good at what they do. I kind of want to hang out with them. So when I have, $20 million to build a house, I'm going to call them. Like, that's ultimately, I think, an even bigger part of the job, because like, it is really important to know people, but I think that's not enough.
Mm-hmm.
So I know everybody, but if I send them all bad projects that are poorly narrated, they're gonna stop reading my emails, right?
Yeah.
And so a lot of what I do also is sort of that micro contextualizing, but then also macro. I say, okay, where do you want to be in your career? And then I try to think about what are the things that you would need to say in every piece of press so that you are furthering this story or this narrative. So a lot of it is sort of long-term strategy as well.
Interesting. So as a publicist, and maybe it would vary on the publicist, are they oftentimes the person that's actually co-writing things, like actually physically writing stuff on behalf of the architect?
Beyond co-writing.
Okay.
I mean, just straight up writing.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And again, everybody's different. And I actually don't know how other publicists work. I mean, I sort of reverse engineered this job from being a writer on the receiving end. But I think that this is what I've seen.
Yeah.
But yeah, the publicist will write. I mean, also there's a robust economy of freelance writers, ghostwriting projects for publicists who work for architects. So I have certainly pretended on the page to be I guess now 77-year-old male architect reminiscing about a project that I did in the 1970s, So there's layers and layers and layers of like, David Foster Wallace has this great short story about some interns working at a magazine. It's part of his collection, I can't remember the name of, but it's all about these interns. And it's clear that the interns are producing the culture. And I sometimes feel like that. Like, architectural discourse is being produced by early and mid-career freelance writers trying to make an extra buck, willing to kind of ghostwrite, produce, copyright, all of that. So,
and the architecture that they're writing about is produced by a bunch of freelancers working remotely across the globe.
Exactly.
What are we doing?
But like you said, that's the world we live in, right? So we can try to fight it, or we can just type the words and cash the checks and hope we contribute something interesting.
I think at the very least we have to understand it, and we first have to recognize that it's there, and then understand it, and then engage with. If only after understanding it, probably engage with it in any kind of meaningful way to the individual. Otherwise, because going back to what you were saying about journalists versus publicists and this kind of the Puritan and the good and the evil, there's a parallel thing in architecture and many professions. Probably, I mean, for architects, there's probably many different analogies, but there's architects on one side, and of course we're the saviors in a certain sense, and then there's the real estate agents, and they're like the evil people who make significant, a lot of money on basically not doing. If I'm talking as an architect, not doing any work, they don't know anything about the architecture. They, they're selling lies to sell the products and the property, and they get this massive check, and they wear fancy shoes and stuff, and that's grotesque. But the reality is that, a lot of architects that we know try to do architecture and they get to the age of 32, 33, kind of like what you're saying, oh, I'm getting older and etc. And they're like, you know what? This is impossible. Screw this. I'm going over to do real estate.
Going to real estate.
Yeah. And maybe then I can also, at least when I'm talking to clients, do it in a way that's a little bit more honest. So yeah, it's funny, this duality.
I mean, I have thought about getting into real estate or becoming a general contractor. I was like, maybe I should just become a contractor, you know?
No, don't do
Once
that.
I did a renovation as a client, I was like, oh, the contractors, that's where the money is.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah,
But
100%. Yeah, for sure. A lot of risk though. A lot of risk.
Yeah.
So I'm a bit curious, why wouldn't, it sounds like you're very excited about like doing this secret publicist gig, right? Why wouldn't you do that full time?
Well, I have ADHD. And so having one job feels like soul death. I sort of did do it. Well, I was going to say I did it full time, but I was also writing a book and teaching and finishing my PhD. So that's not really full time. I really like to work on multiple projects at a time. I think, so part of it is just like the way that my brain is wired, I need to have a lot of different jobs. That's sort of like the overview umbrella. But there could be a way in which I could make this job feel like a lot of different jobs. I mean, I think it's that, like, it's interesting. I enjoy it. I did it very intensely for a couple years, and I actually had 2 full-time employees, and I had 12 clients, and it was a whole business, and I was dealing with like the Illinois Department of Employment Security on a regular basis. And it was really, really exciting when I was learning how to do everything. And then, and I write about this in the book, I kind of hit this point of just total burnout, which I had created. And I'm pretty open about that. I wasn't very good at having boundaries with my clients. I would get really sort of confused. I wasn't very good at like establishing scope. I thought things like that were really boring. I didn't want to talk about deliverables. You know, I was like, I'll just do everything. Like I'll handle, that's sort of my pitch, was I was like, you never have to worry again. I'll handle everything. And I found myself writing speeches for their daughter's weddings. I found myself, you know, like just taking random phone calls and just, I was like, okay, this is not manageable. So I completely quit doing PR for about a year, really needed to kind of reset. And then I started again, just with myself, with a really, really small roster of clients. And I think that is what feels manageable. And I only work now with clients that like I really, really trust, that I know, you know, understand what publicity can do and can't do. Also, I mean, I love writing. Like I love writing books. Like for me, writing isn't a vehicle towards something. It is its own reward. And so always having the space and the time to write books is really important to me. I feel similarly about teaching. Like I love teaching. I teach at Columbia in the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation. I think not having those 2 hours a week to, you know, sit in a seminar room and kind of shoot the shit about whatever is happening while providing an excellent education. I don't know. It would be missing something. So I think I've sort of carefully constructed this life where I don't feel overwhelmed. I don't feel super busy. I feel like I have enough kind of space and time to do everything. And that's more important to me than at this point doing what I did before, which is kind of go all in, build a huge company. I mean, I was really focused on getting new clients. I was really good at it. I love the thrill of like the hustle and the chase. And I write about, there's one client that I kind of like stalked for like a year. You know, I just like put myself in the right position and dropped the right hints and then like got him. And he was like a really big deal. And that felt amazing. And then I was like, oh, now I have to do all this work. You know? So it's like, maybe I'm a good like business development person. So that's my sort of convoluted answer, but it's the honest one. I mean, it's sort of a combination of factors.
Yeah, that's interesting. I can't say that we operate at the level that you're at at all, but given that we have a podcast and sponsors and things like that, there's a little bit
You
of
seem
a...
like you're operating at a very high level. I did some Googling. I was like, okay, you're serious.
I think we also have a sweet spot where like we have multiple things kind of cooking at the same time. And,
it's a sweet spot. I would describe it more as like a cliff's edge. That we're always
sometimes you're on the edge of burning out, but
Right.
when things are too quiet or there's just one task or one type of thing, like I feel like we're not at our happiest level for sure.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's a great way to just meet all my deadlines is if I always have something else that I can work on when I'm on deadline, you know?
Yeah.
So if I only have one deadline, I'm like, oh, this deadline is crushing. But if I have 5, I'm like, okay, this is better than that at least.
Yeah. Just pound them out. I want to talk about your story a little bit because, as you said, you did study architecture. You did that whole gig. You were in studio, and I appreciate you said that you felt it was important because I do think that's one of the experiences that kind of glues a lot of architects together.
Yeah.
So before you went to school, at what point did you realize architecture was going to be of interest, and how did you end up going to school for architecture?
So it's a very typical origin story. I think I was 11 or 12, and my stepdad, who is very interested in design, brought home a book from the Edmonton Public Library. I grew up in Edmonton, Canada.
Oh, really?
And yeah.
We know someone. We know someone from there.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
Oh my God, nobody's from Edmonton. That's
I know. That's why I'm surprised.
Yeah, like we rarely. I lived many places, but that was sort of where I lived between like 10 and 15. So he brought home a book that just, modern architecture. And I think Philip Johnson's Glass House was on the cover. Of course, now I know Philip Johnson was a Nazi and other terrible things, but at the time I was 12 years old and didn't know that, and had never seen a house that was made out of glass. And, I just it was just blew my mind. And I remember looking at this book, and then I saw Le Corbusier's Villa Savoy, and, which is like a box raised on really thin pilotis. And I was just like, what is happening? What? And my stepdad, noticed this interest and really encouraged it. And I think subscribed to El Decor. And we would go to Edmonton, had like one fancy furniture store, and we would go, and I would sort of learn about like the Bauhaus, and he got a table lamp that was designed by Gropius. And I remember, I had terrible taste because my other architect I really liked was Richard Meyer, who we now know was also doing terrible things. But this is like maybe not my fault, but anyway. So I got a book of Richard Meyer houses, and so I'm like 12 years old, and I'm basically giving my parents lectures on the difference between like the Douglas House and the Smith House by Richard Meyer, and was very, very, very interested. And I never built things out of Lincoln Logs or Legos, but I would draw floor plans of my room, and I would draw, cut out little pieces of furniture. And I was always like moving my furniture around at night and putting the furniture into really weird organizations, which leads us to. So then I sort of forgot about architecture. I went to school. I went to boarding school in the UK, where you sort of pick 3 subjects, like really young. So I was 16, and I committed to doing English, German, and theology. Whoa. And applied to college to study theology. Just thinking like maybe I would be not, I was interested in it intellectually, I didn't want to become like a minister. But my parents said, well, why don't you, apply to sort of a more generalist college and, not only stay in the UK, because I was really young. So I applied to universities in the US, and I got into Princeton, and I went to Princeton, and I was like, I'm going to study international relations and become a diplomat. And that was my
smart ambitions, right?
Other random plan. Oh my God, born ambitious, shot out of the womb, just like, I will make my parents proud, But every day, so I did like a very usual sort of freshman collection of classes. I was like taking sociology, I was taking like Eastern European political history, just parachuting in. But I would walk by the architecture building on my way to class, and I would sort of look at it, and I would be like, the like 2 neurons in my brain were like almost connecting. I'd be like, okay, I used to love architecture. Here's the architecture building. On my way to learn more about like the Balkans, which I was not interested in and was not very good at. And finally, one day, I sort of thought, like, what if I just tried studio? So sophomore studio was a really big thing. And at Princeton, the architecture school had this sort of like very self-given mythic status. It was like, oh, you're an architecture major. Like, you wear all black and you chain smoke. And I wore all black and I chain smoked. So I was already like, totally in. So I signed up for a sophomore studio with Professor Lindy Roy, who now teaches at Columbia and runs a firm. And I remember she or somebody else said something like, sophomore studio is like the weeding out process. There's 40 of you here. Only 10 of you are going to go on to become architecture majors because it's so hard. And that, ambition that I'd had from the moment I was born just like lit up. And I was like, I will prevail. And I prevailed through the fact that I was one of the worst architecture students the School of Architecture had ever seen. I mean, I was truly incomprehensibly bad at designing, at building models. I was like, I remember every final review, I would make these models and people would just be like, Eva, why are you an architecture major? And I was, because I love architecture. And everybody else had this like incredible facility with like and this was like before 3D printing. I mean, this was 1999, 2000. We had just gotten Rhino. We were using 3D Max. That was like really exciting. I had a Mayline, like I had an actual physical Mayline my first, studio semester. So I kind of muddled through, and really a combination of like pride and idiocy. I mean, I just insisted on doing architecture. And in my defense, I think I was really good at having ideas. And I think I was really good at, again, sort of talking about my project. So I would present this like completely bananas model that like was falling apart and made no sense. But then I would talk about it and people were like, oh yeah, the ideas are really good. It's just like the execution kind of missing. And I wrote my undergraduate thesis, because everybody at Princeton has to write a thesis. And I wrote my undergraduate thesis. And I remember my advisor, Christine Boyer, sort of taking me into her office and saying, you're actually really, really good at writing about architecture. We had no idea. Nobody knew. Nobody could kind of figure out what you were doing. But I think you should move to New York and write about architecture for a living. And after 2.5 years of people just being like, Eva, what are you doing? That was so amazing to get this moment of validation. And I just like took it and ran with it. And I moved to New York and I wrote about architecture, and a lot of things happened to make that possible. But, I think that my time in studio was really, I brought it up because I think it was really, really important. And even though I, failed, I didn't actually fail, but I feel like I failed at my design projects, it really taught me so much about how architects are trained to think, and how they're taught to think and how they're taught to think through things, and sort of the process of design and the way in which ideas are treated, which I think is very different than how they're treated in many, many other disciplines. And so I noticed when I was a journalist, I would say to somebody like, okay, I did studio, and they would sort of immediately relax. And they were like, okay, we speak the same language. You understand me. I can really talk to you about things like a program and a brief and square footage and schematics and sections and plan. I can read plans. I can read sections. And I think it really sort of gave me an edge and an understanding. So when I went to grad school at UC Berkeley, there was a big sort of drama contention about whether the architecture, history, and theory grad students had to have a studio background. And the historians and theorists were sort of like, listen, I don't want to spend 7 hours a week, drawing things when I'm never going to be a designer. And I probably made a lot of enemies by saying I really think that you learn something that you don't learn in any other way. So I voted to keep studio. And all the grad students hated me. But that's okay.
I think it's interesting.
Hope they thank me now.
I'm obviously I practice as an architect, and we have a podcast, but the podcast is the extent of our media and anything we produce other than architecture or interior design. but the studio is such a particularly special place, and it's kind of a unique space. I mean, I say that having not done other things, but I feel like it's a unique space, and the culture of it. You had mentioned something about that the way ideas are treated within within the architecture, and perhaps even more specifically, architecture studio, is a little bit different. What do you mean by that?
Let me think about like the way into this. So when I first started studio, like my first serious studio, not software studio, was with Galia Solomonov, who is a great architect, current friend. And I thought for, 30 seconds to an hour about what to do. And I drew a project and I said, here's my project. And she said, okay, great. Throw it away. And I was like, no, but I got it. Like, we're good. And she was like, no, do another one. So I sort of, just to be a good student, I was like, oh, okay, you'll draw something else. Great, throw it away. And I sort of went through this series of drawing various iterations and being encouraged to, to throw them away. With the idea that, if it was really the right idea, it would come back to me and it would be insistent and it would be, she wasn't actually saying like disregard all of your ideas, but it was this sort of unattachment to ideas and lack of attachment to particularly your first idea being your best idea. There was a way in which I was taught to work things out in multiple media, right? So I would have an idea. I remember I was working on this project. We were turning diagrams into drawings and models. And my diagram that I chose was of a baby's first, I think, 3 months of life. It was sort of the circadian rhythm diagram, and it was dots for feeding and lines for sleeping. And you would see this beautiful pattern where it starts out like really consistent, and then over time it sort of gets shaped into nighttime, daytime naps. And so I was really interested in how to transform this diagram into a model. I ended up doing this like very weird model that had a bunch of like rods, and then I melted some plexiglass onto them. It was like something about something. Yeah, it was great. But I learned that there was this really iterative relationship between an idea and the representation of an idea. And that's a lot of like my scholarly work now is very interested in the sort of iterative relationship between narrative and design in architecture. And my argument is that like narrative is deeply important, right? So what you say about the model when you're looking at the model on your way to making the next model is as much a part of a design process as just like what you're doing with your hands. And I learned that by doing that in the studio. By thinking about the way in which ideas are not, like models and drawings aren't sort of one-to-one representations of an idea, right? Because I had this idea and the idea was about control, because what I saw in this diagram was the imposition of control onto a baby's schedule. And thinking through what are some ways to represent the idea of control. And for me, it was actually putting this piece of plexiglass on top of a bunch of rods, right? Whether the execution of that was effective, still up for debate 20 years later, I think there's other ways to be more effective. But I was sort of thinking through this like very complicated way of expressing a singular notion. So that's kind of, I think, the design way of dealing with ideas. When I went to do a PhD, I was taught the sort of like academic, very different way of thinking through ideas, which is that you look at sort of a field, right? There's this idea that there's a field and you see all the singular ideas that everybody else has had. And the job of the scholar is to find a gap or find an error to correct. And so it's very precise and you sort of know the outcome when you start, right? So my project intervenes on this very specific historical record in one way by introducing this very particular figure and saying, I'm going to look at Aline Saarinen and what she did for Eero Saarinen. So that's my one argument. And then the second argument is that I'm going to look at how the role of publicists has been disregarded throughout history, right? But I sort of knew where I was going and how to get there. And so it's just a very, speaking of control, it's like a very controlled way of thinking through ideas. And I was taught in grad school to have this sort of incredible discipline with ideas and to always contextualize, but really it's all about refinement and like honing in. And I think the design process is ultimately similar, but it's much more I mean, I keep using this word, but I think it is iterative, right? There is this like sense of kind of like more egalitarian progress, or there's sort of less preciousness about ideas. And I haven't practiced as an architect. I could be totally wrong, but that's sort of my observation with my clients too, is that there's just less attachment to like, this is my idea, this is my argument, and it is only represented in this one way. You know, it's much broader.
That's very fascinating. There's a lot of different things you mentioned that I think are great to talk about. It's interesting. The iterative process is something that is discussed quite often in architecture and architecture education. And the freedom to kind of produce something and then throw it out, then produce something again and throw it out, and just you keep doing it is a bit of a shock to people when they first are told. I feel like a lot of architecture students are told by somebody at some point, like, okay, nice try, kid, do it again. And you're like, but I thought it was good.
Right.
You know?
Well, I remember, Sorry, go ahead.
And but it is part of what we do, and I think any creative struggles with that tension of knowing that they need to be loose in a certain way, but also wanting to roll with what they have. I think there's more and more pressure on younger designers and young offices to put pressure on themselves with the first projects, because it's the first one. You know, by the time you get to fourth year, let's say you're a fourth year undergrad student, you understand the process. You produce a bunch of crap all the time, but you understand that 99% of what you produce is bad, and that's fine. Like freshman students, they do not comprehend that idea. And in particular, I think because of this is getting off topic, but the education system in high school is the opposite of that. Everything's about refining and being very controlled. And when you're told now in this new place to let all that go and start from zero, it's scary.
I remember when my first book was a memoir, and it came out in 2019, and I was teaching at UC Berkeley. I was teaching a writing seminar to freshmen and sophomores, and their papers were due, and they said, how long is a paper? And I said 7 to 10 pages, and they said, great. And I said, how many pages do you think you're going to write to get a 7 to 10 page paper? And they were like, 7 to 10 pages.
Duh.
And I showed them my book, and I said, so my book is going to be published at 240 pages. How many pages do you think I wrote? And they said 240. And I said, I wrote about 2,000 pages to get those 240 pages, right? And that willingness to do that sort of assumption that was what it was going to take to write a book, I think is part of what made the book good. I mean, there were like 120 pages that became 2 paragraphs, and I could not have distilled those pages into those 2 paragraphs needed to be exactly as long as they were. But it did really teach me, like, you look at a finished building and you're not going to know the like 50 potential plans that went into that finished building. You're hopefully just going to be like, wow, everything about this building is right. Everything about this building is exactly the way it should be. But I think you're right. I mean, these students who'd come out of high school, I mean, they were taught to just, here's a bar and you just meet it. And there isn't a lot of energy for, and this sort of gets into like much broader topics, which is like, what's going on with education? What's going on with kids? What's going on with the United States? Like, which may be outside the scope of this current conversation. But I'm really grateful that I was taught to not be precious about any of my work, because I think that has served me very, very well. And architects, I think it serves architects very, very well, and designers. And I was going to say earlier, so my partner is an industrial designer, and we were going to do a project together. And he was like, okay, let's both come up with ideas. And I was like, great. And I came up with 5 ideas, and I wrote them down, and I said, 5 ideas. That's so many ideas. Like, one of them will work. And he said, okay, why don't we each come up with 100 ideas?
Okay.
And I was like, I don't have 100 ideas I will but he went to RISD, and that's what they taught at RISD. It's like, you have 100 ideas, and then one of them becomes the seed for something else that you then enter in. So, I mean, he really, showed me, like, I think I'm so willing to throw things away, but I was like, 5 ideas. I had a heart attack when he said 100.
But I think also, like, talking about like when you start architecture school and you kind of think that your first idea is the best one. I think it probably also comes from the fact that when you're a kid and you make something for like your parents or at school or whatever you make, it's awesome. Everybody loves it. You made it, therefore it's great. Yeah. And then you start architectural school and it's like, no, here, let's start with a clean base. This is absolutely not good. Don't get offended, but you know.
But I think sort of the same thing could apply to other art forms for sure. And, you know, you were talking about the 2,000 pages to 200, which I will like to ask you at some point, like, how did that work? But like one of the most impactful classes I ever had in school was actually an English course. And this was in undergrad, so I was doing architecture, and that's the only thing I cared about. But I had to take this English class. I took it, and I remember I wrote this paper. I submitted it. I got back like a D-. And, you know, in high school, I was like a straight A student. So I was like, what? What was a D-? Why? I did the thing. And she's like, yeah, it's terrible. I'm like, okay. But she had a policy in her class where you could rewrite anything, any of the assignments as many times as you wanted for a brand new grade. It wasn't like if you rewrote it, you got an A, then it averages out to a C. It's like, no, if you reread it and it's an A level, then you get an A for that paper. Wow. And it was like, that's probably the first time I learned that, at least the way I have to write, because I'm somewhat illiterate, is you don't just do it once and then you're good. You do it once and you do it again and you edit and you edit. And editing in my case means rewriting, 50 times potentially.
Absolutely.
And it's not like you do it once all the way through and then you submit.
No. I mean, which is certainly how I wrote. I also got a D- in an English paper in college, and I remember just being horrified, and I was not able to do it over. It's a great teacher. Yeah, that was rough. Because I was also used to people being like, wow, you're such a great writer.
Yeah. But so one of the interesting things too is that, earlier in the conversation, you were saying that architects are often not very good at telling stories around their projects, which I certainly understand. And I think it's in part because my hypothesis is that architects are so deeply engaged in their profession and their craft that that's all they can see, and they don't know how to think from another person's perspective. The odd thing, though, is, and you might have experienced this in school, is that pretty much all architects in school are taught to think about their projects as a narrative, and that we're storytellers. This is something that architects say, we're storytellers, but we use architecture and space and whatever to do it. And I don't know why there's a disconnect, therefore, between, them not maybe being the greatest at communicating their work verbally or in a written language.
Yeah. So that might be, I don't remember being taught anything about storytelling or narrative, but I do remember that the presentation was the biggest thing, right? And that the desk crit, just listening to it, I was like, well, we weren't taught that, but actually we were absolutely taught that through the way in which we were assessed and evaluated, which was the desk crit, which is like, look at my project, here's what I'm doing. And then of course the final presentation, the juried review, which is, I still think when it's well executed is a really, really great pedagogical method, right? Where you're taught to stand up and you present for 5 minutes. And, but I think that part of the disconnect is a sort of lack of valuing language and writing as its own very separate skill set in architecture school. And so to sort of distill my critique is that architects tend to, maybe more than other industries, maybe less, it's sort of the industry that I know the most about, really perpetuate this mythology that architecture is incredibly important and it's incredibly hard. And going back to my sophomore studio project, not that many people can do it. And if you can do it, you low-key are a genius. That I think is really, really taught, right?
Yep.
It's like, we're not the bankers, we're not the hedge fund managers, we're not like whatever, we're architects. We are shaping the world. And so there's this kind of like ego. And what I've observed is that the ego kind of translates into assuming a facility with everything else. So I think that the sort of underlying belief is like, if you're good enough to be an architect, you could probably also do everything else. You just don't have time, right? But if you had time, you definitely could. I run into this with my clients too. They're like, well, the reason I can't do my own PR is I don't have time. And I'm like, No, the reason is you don't know how to do PR, you know?
Excuse
say,
me?
well, they say, I could write this book, but I don't have time. And I'm like, writing books is really hard. Yeah. I've now written 3 books. It's really hard. I went to a lot of school to learn how to be a better book writer. And so I think that like one of the more, it's like this kind of pernicious, like lumping in of like, you know, if I can think about architecture, and even if you can think in a way that is narrative, where you're able to think about storytelling, which I believe that architects are trained to do. Like, I absolutely agree with your premise. I think there's still this missing piece of like, to be really good at writing, you really have to either be good at it or practice or read a lot or do things that a lot of architects don't have time or interest to do. And so part of what I'm always trying to say is like, writing is not the process of transcribing your thoughts, right? It's not like, oh, I have a lot of really good thoughts and I can give really good presentations, therefore I'm a really good writer. Like, writing is a very different, arcane, complicated, infuriating, exhilarating process.
It's a lot of adjectives. I've always been impressed by, because, you know, we have friends who studied architecture. They went off and they're critics of sorts, or they're writers, and that's what they do. And I was always blown away at their ability to write, since I didn't have that. But it's a completely different form, obviously, of expression. Yeah. And it's its own very different thing from architecture and a skill set. So, you know, back when you were saying you went from 2,000 pages to 200, that blows my mind, because if
you can let David know how you did that, that would be helpful for emails he's sending every day to people.
I have an issue with being concise.
An issue? A big issue.
Because like for architecture, I can deal with that because you have the building or the design. It's in one. You can see it in its entirety in one place. That's assumed, sort of. That's the floor plan. I know the floor plan doesn't show everything, but the floor plan, you can see the whole thing. It's there. Yeah. There's the floor plan. Yeah. You can zoom into the details. You can talk about it in 50 different ways. The difference between, at least in my mind, between creating a floor plan and writing something, as you said, it's linear. And my brain, I have a really tough time trying to organize what is in my head a network of ideas into a linear fashion.
I mean, so it's funny that you say, I mean, I also want to say I could never look at a site and design a plan. So like, as much as you're like, how did you do that? I'm like that with what you do. You know, I'm just like, how do you, like, I see what interior designers do. I see what architects do. I see there's this great person on Twitter, Marilyn Modinger, who will sort of take a plan and she'll just redline over it and be like, here, I made it better. And I'm like, I can't have, you know, so it's as incomprehensible. In terms of the making something linear, so my friend and colleague, Marina and I, we have a sort of ongoing conversation about how, as writers, 99% of what we do is organize our thoughts, which is really her phrase, right? So I'm totally borrowing from her. So she says, you know, I'm going to organize my thoughts. And I think this is one of the keys, is that I spend very little time actually typing. Honestly, probably like 2 to 3 hours a week total, right? And I write books this way because I spend the other 98% of the time, what I think of as just walking around and looking at stuff and, you know, doing my PR work. But mostly what I'm doing is organizing my thoughts. And so a lot of the work is really internal. I guess I'm thinking like, now, where do those 2,000 pages come from? That's because that was my first book. I didn't know how to organize my thoughts internally. I had to like try them all out. You know, I had to really be like, let's see if we should go in this direction. But I think that like, I mean, this is why I sort of reiterate that like, I've been writing professionally for 20 years. I took multiple workshops at UC Berkeley with like very, very good fiction and nonfiction writers. I've really studied how to do this. I really learned the difference between like a 750 word story and a 62,000 word memoir. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of practice. It kind of takes as much time and practice as like being able to do your first ground up building. I think to sort of be a responsible writer, but it's really hard. I mean, I'm sort of like fumbling. So I'm like, it's just really, really hard. And I have a book now that I'm working on, which is a memoir of, I got married and then I got divorced. And I thought it would be good to write a book about that. And I have written and rewritten this book like 8 or 9 times, and knowing where to start the book was really hard. It was a really, really difficult decision. And especially with memoir, you think like, well, you start at the beginning and you end at the end, but where's the beginning? Where's the end? I don't know, right? Is the beginning, for this is the beginning when my parents divorced when I was 1, which gave me some core wound, which I tried to solve by getting married at 32, 33. Like, is that where it starts? Does it start on the day I get married? Does it start on the day that, all these decisions about how to even make something feel linear are really hard. And I spent a lot of time texting Marianella being like, okay, I fixed my book. And then a day later, I'm like, fuck, I broke my book.
I broke my book.
I fixed it. Okay, nope, broke it. And with the last draft, I was like, okay, there's an 80% chance that I can fix it. 20% chance it's just going to fall apart. And so I think this idea of like holding a cohesive story or creating a cohesive story or creating a cohesive narrative, I mean, it's just like, it takes a lot of, for me, maybe not for everybody, it just takes a lot of like willingness to try again and move things around and like Frankenstein this book together and then be like, oh, now it doesn't flow. And so you throw it out and then you rewrite it. And in that way, I think it's similar to a design process, right? Where I have to be sort of as not precious about it. And it's been my observation that like writers who really are just like, okay, I'm a writer, I'm going to write books. We're all kind of willing to do that. And then a lot of like people who I meet in a restaurant who are like, I have a great book idea. How long could it take? How hard could it be? I'm like,
yeah.
Which I think is similar to like, oh, I can design a kitchen. Like I can buy a sofa at West Elm. And you're like, well,
you could.
I think
it's going to be good. I don't know.
Yeah, you could do it. Yeah, it's possible.
Yeah, you can do a book. Yeah, sure.
Technically, it would be a book, I guess.
Anyone buy it, then read it? Yeah.
I think anyone who is really good at their craft, or at least has that kind of intensity about it, understands and appreciates what they don't know about other people's crafts. I mean, that is the one thing that I think is the common amongst a lot of. Although at the same time, I would also agree that a lot of architects think they can do everyone else's job. That you're spot on with that, like 100%. And
oh, I'm so glad.
No, it's for sure true. And at some point in my career, it's like, yeah, that's not true. I don't know why I've been thinking about that with myself.
You were taught that. I mean, because you were just taught that by the architecture field, and like I'm sure every professor like somehow put that into your head, and every it's like I think you came by it honestly. Like,
no, I think that's true. It's I've heard it so many times, even in the school setting at crits. The critics or teachers will say, well, architects, you guys are everything. You're sculptors. You're client relationship people. You are engineers, but not really. You're what's the other one they say? Graphic designers. I'm like, yeah. Have you ever met like a real graphic designer? They're in a different league than all of us. Like, let's not pretend.
You don't have to dab in those things, but again, it doesn't mean you're going to be good at it.
Yeah. I mean, one of the great complaints that my industrial designer partner has is when he designs lighting fixtures and furniture, and he'll say like every architect thinks that they can design a lighting fixture, and like it's really hard. It's really, really hard to design a lighting fixture. You have to think about all these things. And the more I sort of learn about his work and look at his designs and sort of start to understand like why, I'm like, oh yeah, that's why it took you 3 years, to design the chandelier. And these architects are like, well, we couldn't find it, so we designed it ourselves. And there's one that I won't name, specifically an architect that I'm thinking of, and they designed a light fixture, and I was just like, yeah, it doesn't work.
Yeah, it's funny. Who's your partner's name, by the way? Would we know him?
Paul Lobach. He designed the Halo chandelier for Roland Hill. That's sort of the flagship lighting project.
Yep. We know of his stuff from. Well, we can talk, but we know. From
nice lighting.
Very, very nice lighting. But I like the point you bring up though, because we've had instances where we are asked if we will design this furniture piece or do whatever, and It's a tricky question to answer for us, because if it's a piece that's kind of in the background or something, and there's not a lot of pressure on it, and whatever other reasons, maybe. If it's a piece that's going to be more central, it's like, okay, you either have to pay us a lot of money and give us a lot of time to get it somewhere close to like the furniture pieces you see online, or no, you go buy something, because you can't hobble together and hack together the things that you see, like these lighting fixtures.
Exactly. I mean, when he was telling me about like I think it did take 3 years from initial sketch to production for, what looks like sort of a simple form, which is concentric rings illuminated with LED. Like you would sort of think like, but the way that they go together, the details, everything was so considered. And getting to be, I wasn't there for the design, but just sort of hearing about it now and seeing him work on new projects, I'm like, right, this like prototyping takes a long, long time. And we were in Vienna and I sort of solved a book problem, and he showed me a sketch of a new chandelier. And to me, I was like, babe, it's done. You got it. Same as that like sophomore. I was like, you got the idea. And he was like, okay, so now the work really begins, right? Like now it's like, what is the scale? And with light, you have to also think about the illumination and, all these things. So I think I respect that you're like, we could do it, but also let's just think about like maybe the person who's been designing a sofa for 30 years.
Yeah.
Maybe they know something. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
How did you get into being a publicist for architects? Because I know that you kind of mentioned the journalists have a view of the publicists, but did you start off with one client and someone asked you, can you help me with this, or? Basically,
yeah. So I was like a full-time architecture journalist from 2003 to 2009. So we all remember what happened in 2008.
Yeah.
I moved to Portland, Oregon for a year, where I mostly lay on the floor and cried and ate a lot of Oreos and was like, my career is over. It's just like, I remember I was applying to work as a barista and they were like, you're underqualified. And I was like, oh my God, I am underqualified. I was just like, my life is over. And my best friend, who I'd sort of followed to Portland, was applying to grad school. So I was like, all right, I always sort of wanted to go to grad school. So I got into grad school and had actually seriously thought about it for years and always wanted to go to Berkeley for some reason that I now can't remember. But I got into Berkeley and I was super pumped. It was the only grad school that I applied to. And I completely left journalism behind. I basically was like, okay, now I'm like a full-time grad student. And I was thinking about it recently. I was like, God, I loved being in grad school for the first couple of years, because after years of just like hustling and making my own schedule and like having so much financial precarity and insecurity, I was just like safe in a sort of like warm embrace of this place. And I had somewhere to be all the time, which was amazing. So I really, really liked it. And I was like, great, I'll just be a professor. Like I'll go to grad school, I'll get a PhD, I'll be a professor. My parents are all professors. So I sort of have that as a model. This is where I acknowledge my tremendous privilege. And I did that for like 4 or 5 years. I sort of like was steadily plotting ahead. And Joe Fletcher, again, who was sort of, it seems, my fairy godmother in all things, he wanted to be friends because we were both sort of architecture media people living in Berkeley. So we met, and then he was working with some architects and they needed their website to be rewritten. So they called me and they were like, can you rewrite our website copy? And I was like, great, I will charge you not very much money and you can do it. And they said, great. And then I did it. And then we had a meeting and they were like, well, we actually sort of want somebody to help us with like marketing and editorial. And I said, well, I don't do marketing, but I could probably figure out how to help you get published. And I just, in 20 minutes, kind of wrote up this proposal. And the proposal was basically, here are all the people that I know. Like I know people at Curb, I know people at House Beautiful, I know people at the New York Times. And I sort of just figured like I could probably do this. And so I quoted them kind of a monthly retainer and they were like, that seems fine. And then they had a couple projects and I knew just enough about how projects needed to get published. I knew about exclusives and photography and licensing and all that from being on the other side. And they really just sort of went with it, which was great. And I had only them for a couple months, and then they recommended me to, or maybe somebody recommended me to another firm, and I had a meeting with them. And by this point, I had like a little bit more of a sense of kind of what I could do and how I could do it. And then I had another introduction, and then I had like 4 clients. And then I remember thinking like, okay, this is like, it was just me with my personal Gmail address. I was like, okay, I need to like, do something a little different. And then I had a research assistant at UC Berkeley who I'd been paired with as part of this like undergraduate sort of mentor-mentee thing. And I was like, are you around? Can you help me just like figure out what I have to do? And so I hired her, and then Marina was actually graduating, and I was like, oh, maybe Marina can help me write in the way that like I had helped publicists write, so it was like very random. And then I suddenly got very worried about my taxes because I was making more money than I'd like ever made in my entire life, which is not that much. I want to be clear, but like I had to worry about taxes, and my accountant was like, oh, I think you should, incorporate. And so then I learned about incorporation, and then I put everybody on payroll, and then I was dealing with like W-2s, and suddenly I was like an employer registered with the California Employment Development Department, who continue to be a absolute nightmare. I don't know if you've had to deal with the EDD on corporate issues, but I basically had a very steep learning curve. And yeah, I just like with every client, I just got a little bit better at knowing exactly what I was selling, exactly what a metric for success would be, how to sort of prepare them. But it really started with just these 2 architects who kind of, in retrospect, were just like, yeah, let's just try this and see if it works. And it did.
Amazing.
So that was it. Yeah.
I think one thing for architects who might be listening, this is kind of a basic question, but why would an architect need a publicist? I guess there's maybe a lot of ways to tackle that. One is, why should an architect care about that? That's maybe one route. And the other route is, assuming an architect wants to get published, why would I need someone to write for me? Let's say I can write well enough on my own. I know the project better than anybody. I can hire a photographer. I'll just submit it. Like, what is the fuss about?
Yeah. So the first question, like, why would you kind of want to get published? Is I guess it's what I heard you ask. I think publishing doesn't do that much for people, which I've learned to say. But I think what it does is there's a lot of different sort of business issues that architects have to think about, right? So one is getting new work. One is hiring really good people. One is having, once you get the new work, like, is it going to be a really combative relationship with a client who doesn't really understand you or understand what architects do? Or is it going to be with like a pretty educated client? I think that publication can help with all of those in a way, right? So I always tell my clients, I'm like, listen, especially when they have a big story. So I have a client right now, they're going to be in the New York Times in like a week and a half. And I keep telling them, I'm like, this is great. This is major. Like, it's going to be really fun. Do not expect the phone to ring the day the New York Times story comes out with like 5 new client requests, right? But what you can expect is that in 4 or 5 years, you will continue getting published. And when somebody gets referred to you or somebody finds you on Google and they see all your press and they read it, it's going to maybe tip them over the edge a little bit to go with you, right? So it's really incremental, but it is sort of like validation and confirmation. So it's kind of one thing is like, you have to go get the client, but the media can kind of help that client be like, okay, a lot of other people have trusted you with a massive amount of money. I like the projects that I see. I like what you say about them. I'm going to give you a call. I'm going to like take you seriously, right? It can kind of just like help a little bit. I think it can really help in terms of hiring, right? So I know a lot of architects, they really struggle to find good people. It's hard to get the best architects out of school. With that, I'm like, yeah, if you're a slightly more famous firm or you have a little bit more name recognition, you're going to get more applicants, right? Yeah. It's just like, and then I'm like, you have to pay them well, all of that. Very pro-union, very glad that Andy Bernheimer recognized his firm's union, right? That was awesome. And then And then the third thing is like having an educated client. I briefly, for one of my clients, I would sort of field new client requests. And I remember one very nice person called and she said, so, I just saw your client on the cover of Dwell. I really like a house. If we were to hire him, could we tell him what material we want on the front of the house? And I was like, yes. And like, I was like, well, it's way beyond that, like hiring somebody at his caliber to do a custom house for you. It's sort of this like very complicated project. And I realized that if she had maybe read more articles or seen more articles, and that was like the first project that he and I worked on together, she just might have sort of more of a sense of like what that collaboration would look like, what you hire an architect for, the value of getting, a specialty architect. So I think that's part of it. So that's sort of like the benefit. And then to your second question, like why hire somebody? And I am expensive. And part of what, I come up against is like, well, I could hire a designer for what you cost yearly, and I'm like, okay, yeah, but a designer would design, not do this. So there's a couple of things. So one, going back to your sort of earlier suggestion about like relationships. So publicists will have relationships with every writer. A good publicist will have a good relationship with every writer. And they will know who is the right person for your project, which is really, really important, right? So you could absolutely, as an architect, send your project to submissions at metropolismagazine.com, right? The publicist's job is to know exactly who's on the masthead, exactly who's freelance writing, what kind of projects have recently been published, the editorial calendar, the mood of the editor-in-chief, how stressed out the editor-in-chief seems to have been. This is how I approach it. I don't know if everybody is this like granular, but I think part of why I'm good at my job is that I pay incredibly close attention. And they sort of know, like, okay, I'm going to have, a single family residential project in California that I want to pitch to, let's say 3 magazines and newspapers, in order. So I need to start having dinner with the writer now and mentioning like, oh, this is how I do it, right? It's like, oh, I got this new client. I'm super excited about it. Yeah, I'll send you the project when it's ready. And you're seeding, you're kind of incepting. All of that takes a lot of mental capacity and fortitude and ability to really, really keep very close eye on what's going on. And a number of architects that I talk to, they want to be published, but they're not reading the magazines. I mean, the number of clients who are like, I desperately want to be in this magazine. Oh, I don't read it. I'm like, okay, don't say that. Being interviewed, say that you read it every time. But it's sort of, I say it's like my job to read the magazines, to keep track, like, oh, interesting, this person just moved from New York to LA and they got this job at this magazine, which means that the magazine is probably like paying them because I know that they're mid-career. And if they're mid-career, they're probably getting like X salary range, which means that the magazine is actually like really invested in its own health and growth, which means that probably they're going to be, it's like all that stuff comes into a pitch and the way that I pitch and when I pitch and the time. And I also know, like, I have one colleague who I pitch pretty frequently, and he likes to be pitched in this very specific way where he kind of doesn't want to be told anything. Like, he just wants the images because he is sending it to magazines like Digest and Elle Decor, where the images are really, that's what's going to pop. Like, Digest and Elle Decor, they care about the quality of the photography. Digest cares a lot about who the clients are. But they don't care when you're pitching about, the really complicated architectural moves. When I pitch wallpaper doesn't care who the clients are. Wallpaper is totally fine with anonymous clients. But Ellie, the architecture editor, Ellie Sataki, she's fantastic. She's really, really smart. She thinks a lot about architecture. So when I pitch her a project, I'm like, okay, the architects are this is kind of their deal. The clients are like a couple. That's all I need to say. And then I'm like, here are the architectural moves that are interesting. And so a good publicist, I think, is kind of that attuned to like exactly who they're pitching and how, and always having a direct line of contact so that you're never submitting to submissions at or editorial at or ideas at or whatever. And kind of having the stamina to do that and the interest in doing that, I think is like a pretty high value offering,
Mm-hmm.
which again is why I charge so much, because I'm like, yeah, I'm maintaining all these relationships so that you don't have to. And then the last sort of thing that I'll say is that often editors are really competitive, right? And so you, as an architect, might have a relationship with an editor at like magazine X, right? But you actually kind of want to get published in magazine Y. But you have this relationship with the editor, and you know if you send your project to magazine Y, editor X is going to be like, why didn't you send it to me? I treated you so well last time. I gave you 7 pages. Like, you are disloyal. And when you have a publicist as the designer, you kind of get to, again, like with this like purity thing, you get to sort of maintain innocence. And you're just like, oh man, like that was my publicist. Like, I don't know what she's doing. And I tell my clients, I'm like, listen, I am here for you to blame me. Right. So if like an editor gets mad, and this has happened where there's an editor at a magazine and she's like, I should get all these projects. And I gave the project to the Wall Street Journal instead. And now I'm the bad guy. But my client, her relationship is totally great, right? Her relationship with the editor's like, oh man, like Eva really threw a wrench in things. And I'm like, oh yeah, I'm just like a loose cannon, like you can't. But my client was like happy that they were in the Wall Street, so
yeah.
I think there's a way in which you sort of create this like third party, and you're just like, oh, like, I don't know what she's doing, but like, I would have given it to you, definitely, even though I'm sort of like pulling all the strings. So
yeah, that's an interesting way to view it, the distinction between the different responsibilities and tasks, and therefore different people. It makes things a lot easier. This is kind of, not to get off topic, but it's a similar thing. We were talking with an architect the other day, and he was like, I have someone else do my billing for me within the office, because then I'm not the bad guy. This other individual, if there's an issue with an invoice, they take care of it. Do not talk to me about it at all. And so when he comes into a meeting, he's like the designer, right? And there's no kind of confusion about who's to blame or whatever.
Exactly. It's so smart. I mean, I know people who pretend to have assistants do their invoicing. They like make a whole fake email address and it's just them, because it just keeps it. And that's the thing, is like, I want architects to have really, really good relationships with every journalist that they encounter, because I want the journalist to like them and want to do a good story. So I'm like, I don't want to have the designer getting all up in the editor's face about like photo licensing, and they have to pay the photographer, and like they don't have this access, and they can't say this, and they can't, because like this project that I'm doing right now, the client, her job is like, you can do this project, but you can't say where you work. So I'm making sure that that's okay with the publication, so that when she talks to the journalist, they just have a lovely conversation. So it's like, it's just multiple modes of like buffering, and which does mean that like people get mad at me, which I don't like, but my cross to bear,
The other thing with all this, which is interesting, is there's this kind of symbiotic relationship, I guess you could call it, between the publicists, the editors, and then the architects, and everyone's kind of working through or with each other in whatever capacity. And it's all pointing toward creating a narrative and creating a personality sometimes about the specific architect, or a personality about the work, which I feel like would be your job, I guess, to kind of clarify and wrap it up nicely to make it understandable to people, make it sellable, make it understandable, make it all these things, which is, I think, maybe some true hardcore architects would dismiss because they just care about the details of their work. But there's kind of like, if you have any help, I think there was something you wrote in an article a few years ago of, there's kind of this misconception of how fame is produced in this day and age. We just actually, you said it during earlier in this recording. There's this assumption, if I see an architect in a newspaper or the New York Times, it's like, oh, the editor must have found it randomly, plucked them out, as you said, purely because of their genius. But there's a whole machine behind all of it.
That's what I thought for a long time.
I know. I'm sure we all did.
I moved to New York, and I realized every single big architecture firm has a PR. And I was like, what?
Exactly.
I did not know that.
Exactly.
So can you, I don't know, maybe this bleeds into also your upcoming book, but the importance of having, recognizing and having understanding that the people who are helping cultivate this story that is out there of the architect.
Yeah. So the book is called When Arrow Met His Match, Aline Luchem-Saarinen, The Making of an Architect. And I use this case study to explain kind of why things work the way that they work now. So very briefly, 1953, Eero Saarinen was like a moderately well-known Finnish American architect. He was living in Bloomfield Hills. He had done some projects. He was getting some press. The press was all pretty confused about what to do with him. He designed the St. Louis Arch, which wasn't built yet, but he won the competition in 1948 against his father, which was like his big split with Elio. And Aline actually wrote about the arch for the New York Times in 1948, which is like sort of fun. But he did a lot of buildings that had curves. And in the 1950s, people were just like, what? I've never seen a building like this before. And so she was an associate art critic for the New York Times. So she was a journalist, and she was assigned a profile of him. She flew to Bloomfield Hills. Some shenanigans unfolded very, very quickly. They did not waste a lot of time really getting to know each other. And she flew back to New York and basically started like a pretty intense campaign of getting him to leave his wife and marry her. And part of what she offered in multiple letters was this idea that she would sort of help him. And her phrase was like, I'll help you through talk to think through ideas and think through things. And she was like, also, I kind of know how the media works. So, I could help you get published, and I could help you get new projects, and I could really help sort of crystallize. And
so
he was like a little more.
So part of the marriage proposal was to say
business plan?
Literally.
Really?
She said, she wrote this letter and she was like, the candidate wishes to apply for the job. And the job was wife and publicist, basically. She didn't use the word publicist, but yeah, and he's like, well, I think that the candidate is very fit for, many of these qualifications. Also, they're also
How
like
funny.
sexting while they're doing this. It's great, though.
Right.
I mean, the story is very juicy, I have to say. So I'm always like, it's like a serious book. It's put out by by Princeton University Press. Like it went, but it's also like, it's a pretty rollicking read of just two people, like, trying to figure out if they're gonna keep this going. So she basically sort of outlines, what she can do for him. And she keeps reiterating like, hey, I'm really good at talking about architecture. Like I'm really good at describing it. And she was a really extraordinary architecture critic. And he eventually sort of agrees, and they get married, and she moves to Bloomfield Hills, and she becomes head of information services. And she basically starts managing all of his publicity. And one of the most interesting case studies that I use, which is sort of my final like aha chapter, is about the TWA terminal. And Saarinen, as you say, he knew every detail of the building inside and out. He was very interested in the majesty of the jet age, right? So this is now like 1959, 1960, like airplanes are kind of coming into public consciousness, like taking a trip is really amazing. There was a piece published in Architectural Record, and the title was, I want to catch the excitement of the trip, right? So flying on a plane was like, you got dressed up for it. It was like an event. And so Saarinen is sort of very interested also in like, like humanity's capacity for like sort of humanism, and he was like, oh, like people, like they'll be in a building and they'll feel the grandeur of the human experience. And Aline was like, okay, here's what you're going to say. You're going to say it looks like a bird. And he was like, no.
Yeah.
Like this building is blah, 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 blah. And she's like, no, you're going to say it looks like a bird about to take flight. And I trace very methodically and rigorously the way in which this idea that the TWA building is a bird through the popular media. There's a piece in the New York Times published in, I think, 57, 58, where the building was like under construction, and the headline says bones for a bird. And the picture is of like a bunch of wood. And you're just like, the story is like, this bunch of wood looks bananas. What could it possibly be? Well, it's, the structure for what's going to be this poured concrete building that's going to look like a bird in flight. And so you see that people were like, oh, this, because the TWA terminal at JFK looks unlike any other building. I think it's hard to describe. I'm like, it has some curves. It's symmetrical. The inside is like big, but it feels small, and the walls are curved, but also like, but then you sort of have this idea like, oh, it's like a raptor crouching. And you can kind of, if you look at it with that lens, it's like, oh, this is a really cool building. It makes me think of like a raptor about to take flight, which makes me think about the magic of flight, so I sort of trace this way in which Aline introduces this like very singular narrative idea, this like very singular encapsulation. And importantly, the way in which Arrow was like, can you stop talking about the bird? And
Really?
she was like, no. Yeah, he was like, I really don't like it. I mean, there's a letter that I found where he's like, I do not like this bird idea. Stop, I'm paraphrasing. It's like, stop talking about the bird. And she's just like, no. And there's another great example where he was on the cover of Time magazine, and there's this whole story about how they're having breakfast, and he looks at a grapefruit and he turns the grapefruit over, and he's like, oh, this is, how architecture should be made. And anybody who knows anything about Eero Saarinen, he was not inspired by grapefruits. I mean, but Aline understood that a journalist for Time magazine needed to be sort of spoon-fed, these ideas about how architectural forms were produced. Because if Eero just kind of went like off script, he would be like, oh, the grandeur of the catenary curve. And people would just be like, I don't know what that is.
Yeah.
So I don't know that exactly. And I'm trying to remember what your question actually was, which I don't think is the question that I answered. But
no, this is all exactly it. I mean, this is the meat of it.
Okay. Yeah.
But I sympathize with Mr. Saarinen, because most architects that I know would be like, no, that's not how it happened. But
you do realize how brilliant she was, though, in coming up with those ideas.
I mean, it seems to be like it's fair to say that he would not have reached his level of notoriety or fame and et cetera had it not been for her.
That's my contention. Yeah. I mean, that's my argument. So just to very briefly finish the thought. So she was the first person who did what she did. She was the first person who really professionalized this role. Artists were used to having publicists. Publicity as a field was kind of invented in the 1920s by Edward Bernays, who was like, he was trying to like sell pork or something. I mean, it was like really, it was not in the field of architecture. And Aline was in conversation with various editors like Douglas Haskell at Architectural Forum about practices like exclusives, right? Like giving one magazine images and not giving another magazine images, which now is really standard. I show like she was working that out kind of in conversation. And so she really formalized and professionalized this role under guise of just providing information, right? Her job was head of information services. But you look at now, I mean, you're right. Like every firm that is over probably 10 to 12 people has a publicist whose job it is to do exactly what she did, which is manage the inflow and outflow of images, manage where things are going to be published. But I really wanted to show, like, one, this is a job that exists now that most people don't know about. And two, it was really created by this one couple. And I think it's also really interesting that they were a couple, which, is also kind of, I mean, there's like a little bit in the book about like, the male architect and the female like helper. And she even says, she's like, I'll be your helpmate. And she was very accomplished on her own. But she was really, I mean, she just really loved him, and she was like, I will just move to Michigan and make you famous. And she did.
So she kind of like took on that role for an architect, you said, back in the 50s. And now, I mean, like we experienced when we were in New York, a few years ago, like it's very common for all of those offices to have PR. But what happened between the 50s and today? Like when did that big click in people's mind really happen to think about using PR to help their career?
But having publicists. I mean, I wish I knew the answer to that. I sort of jumped between the 50s and today. I mean, I would imagine that it was just more and more gradual, where editors would realize like, oh, having somebody on staff who only handles this is really useful. I mean, I'm really just speculating now, but, like maybe they would, contact an architect and say like, oh, do you have somebody, in the office who handles photography or who handles publications? And so there was sort of this like demand and then supply, and, like she was supply when there was no demand. And then I think the editors were like, oh, this is so great. So then they sort of produced a little bit of demand, which then produced supply. I mean, I think publicity in general, like having publicists, I mean, I'm just thinking now about like movies, and how that whole world of movie stars has been so controlled by publicists. So I think there was like in the 80s and 90s really like sort of a consciousness about publicity being something about publicists managing. Like the 90s was like the heyday of movie publicists. I mean, I remember like, just reading about like PMK, who was like Tom Cruise's publicist, like the publicists sort of enter the consciousness. But
right.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I knew. Actually, I'm really just hypothesizing. But at some point, I mean, as you were saying, like the machine just cemented itself, and now it's here.
Especially now, I mean, with the internet, essentially, right, and all the different media outlets, it's complicated.
But I think also that kind of opened up the doors to everyone thinking that everyone could be famous. It's just a matter of, maybe hiring the right people and having the right pitch and being published in the right place, right? Or maybe back in the 50s, there was only like, I don't know, a handful of architects and the smaller guys just didn't care as much about fame. You know?
Yeah.
That's my guess.
That's such a good point, right? There were like 5 or 6 magazines in the 50s and everybody read them and they were, the Bibles of the industry, which is not the case now. But yeah, I think like getting famous was kind of, I don't know, both harder and easier. I mean, now I think like moments of fame can be kind of bought in various ways, but I don't know if it's harder or easier to get famous now.
It's 100% different.
It's easier to get.
It's different.
It's just different. It's so different. It's like fame now is not.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's funny because I think some of the lessons from all of this, I think that for a lot of architects, they might be quite dismissive of some of these ideas, right? But I think some of the lessons from it apply to other places as well. I mean, even if you go to, I'm trying to think of okay, if you're a young designer, you're trying to get a job at an office, one of the first rules of how to get a job or how to apply and stuff is they need to know who you are, right? If you submit a portfolio and you're one of 1,000 at DSR or whatever, unless you know someone there, or unless you harass them, as I did in many offices, they won't know who you're going to be. Your needle in a haystack. It's never going to happen. And so there's a little bit of, I wouldn't call it fame, but you need to be present. Yeah. That's the first thing that needs to happen. The same thing applies to here for sure, and in terms of getting clients or having some kind of notoriety within your own community.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is, I mean, I'm like, should we talk about Instagram? We don't have to. We could save ourselves, but I think that is like where a lot of students particularly seem to have this like innate understanding that they need to have a presence online and they need to have a brand and they need to, the last seminar that I taught was called Architectural Arguments. And we just sort of looked at different ways in which architecture is argued about and ideas about architecture are cemented. And I said they had to like take Twitter really seriously. They had to take Instagram really seriously. And I had one student who it turned out had, 18,000 followers on Instagram and is sort of known for he did like his name's Nick Bentel. He did this very, very cool project where he turned a Barilla pasta box into a purse and would do these drops. And it was clearly just like very savvy and very smart. And I remember asking in class once, I was like, everybody was saying they didn't really know how to use Instagram. And Nick was sort of like hedging a little bit. And I think somebody said that he actually had a following. And I was like, oh, Nick, are you famous? And he was answered very politely, but I just thought about like, I think that's like asking somebody if they're rich. Like you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to sort of say like, oh, are you famous? And he was like, no, I mean, I have,
I have a little bit of money.
Like, oh, yeah. I was like, no, you are famous. Like you actually aren't, and then I was like, okay, I gotta like stop this because I'm like pushing some sort of button.
That's funny.
Yeah. So I think that I mean, fame, I gave this talk at Yale. Well, Marina gave it in my absence. It was all about fame. And we were sort of trying to figure out like, why would anybody want to be famous? And I think to tie to, are you rich? I mean, they want to be famous so that they have some, financial security. Because you're more likely to get more projects if you're famous. And like you said, you're more likely to get a job if you're famous. And so I think there is this way in which we're taught to like be I don't know, very public. I'm just thinking about, this will sound self-aggrandizing, but I truly don't mean it to be. But my sister-in-law is a member of a pottery studio in Brooklyn. And she said that she went and met somebody who said that they were an architecture writer. And she said, oh, do you know Eva Hagberg? And he said, oh my God, yeah, she's famous. And my sister-in-law was like, are you like, do people know that? Because she was like, I just thought you were like, I was like, I wouldn't consider myself famous at all, but I'm also not surprised that an architecture writer knows my name. And then she was I could see she was like recalibrating her like kind of weird older sister-in-law and being like, oh, should I like take you
more seriously?
I mean, she's, like she's great. Like I was gonna say, she's very, very nice. I love her very much. We're very close. We're very good friends, but we don't talk about like my public life, at all. And so I think it was just a moment where she was sort of saying with like me and my student, where I was like, oh, okay, you're famous. How do I,
That's what I did have I did have a student who only after having him as a student, like after studio was done, like months, maybe even a year later, I realized that they were, and this is the first time I'd learned the term, he was an influencer. And I was like, what? I was like, what is an influencer? Wow. And I was shocked by this term. And Marina knew of it, so she was like, what are you, like, come on.
My eyes.
How do you not know this? I'm like, I've never heard of this. I was joking. I said, so you guys like wear black capes and like meet on like, in cemeteries, or like, what do you do?
Yeah.
And he's like, no, influencer means X, Y, and Z. I'm like, oh, wow. And so it's funny because now when I think back to when I had him in studio, I'm like, oh, that's why, not why, but everyone in the studio must have known, all the other students must have known that he had like over 200,000 followers or whatever. And I was like the only one in the dark, but
do you think it would have changed your pedagogical approach if you had known?
Nah.
Are you glad that you didn't? No. Yeah,
I'm glad I didn't know, but I don't think it would have changed anything. I mean, he was a very good student and humble anyways, but it's an odd dimension to people for sure.
Yeah.
I want to ask, with Saarinen and Aline, is how you pronounce the name, right? They were both selling kind of different stories of the architecture, the grapefruit or the bird versus the the tensile strength of concrete or whatever it was.
Right.
Would that not create some kind of conflict in the public's eye, where people are like, well, this whole bird thing must have been a hoax or a facade, or something?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I think she was able to sort of get him to capitulate enough that they had sort of like a unified front, right? So he, behind the scenes, was like, can you drop the bird thing? And then in interviews, he was like, yes, the soaring bird. So I think that was how, but they did, I mean, one of the sort of like tragic things about being a biographer with no boundaries is that I was like fully in love with Aline the entire time I was writing about her. And I was like really happy when I was reading their early letters. And I was like, oh, they're so in love. This is so great. They're so perfect for each other. And then, she moves in with him. So there was much fewer letters. And then towards the end of his life, there's sort of a resurgence of the office memo where they're sending each other office memos about various issues. And you can see there's one in particular where there's sort of layers and layers of responses where he's like, isn't this your responsibility? And she's like, this is your letter, you should answer it. And he's like, no, it's your department. And then she said, they don't have a crystal ball. So they did have, tension, right? They did sort of argue about things. I don't see that having bled into the public sphere. I think because she was so connected and so effective, and she was very much the point of contact with all of the editors, right? So I sort of went through thousands of letters that she wrote to Cranston Jones, who was an editor at Record, and James Hornbeck, who was at Record, and Douglas. And so she really, I think, was powerful enough that she could sort of like incept them ahead of time, enough that when they did talk to Arrow, if he said anything that was sort of not on message, they would have been so thoroughly incepted by her and prepared that they would kind of like disregard it. And I think now that's why, I know some publicists who insist on being on every interview with their client to make sure that their client stays in line. And that's not my practice. Okay, so right? So I prepare my clients ahead of time, and I'll send them a document and I'll say, these are your talking points. Talk about this. don't talk about this. If they ask about this, deflect in this way. So I think that a lot of publicists are either on the line and they jump in and they're like, well, what I think, Jimmy meant to say was, and then like something completely different. Because you don't want architects to be just like, what? I mean, architects say the darndest things, right? So
the darndest things. It's I do think the biggest challenge for architects in general is that they have so many different ideas in their minds about a project, and I think most designers would agree that when you have a robust project, a building, it functions, performs, and is interesting to the designers in 1,000 different ways, right? And it becomes very, very, you could talk about the site, the program, the budget, the construction, the technology, the concept, whatever. And it becomes very, very difficult for a person who is seeing the project in that multi-universe way to talk about it sometimes in a coherent manner where you don't sound, like you have issues, because you're kind of overwhelmed with the information. You don't know, and you don't know how to kind of sculpt the information, to refine it, to filter it, and to shape it into something that is coherent, let alone interesting.
Well, and that's the thing about the sort of organizing our thoughts idea, right? Is that it's very different skills to, I think it's an extraordinary skill to be able to turn a multiplicity of interests and facilities and talents into a building. Like, I just think that is extraordinary. And then to also have to choose which of those ideas is going to be the one that is going to, that's just too much. Like, I don't think one person can both create and narrate, which is sort of my fundamental argument.
Right.
And know that, also sort of going back to like the specifics of my job is part of what I see my job as doing is knowing like, okay, this magazine is going to really be interested in like, what did the client want and how are you a service provider, right? Whereas this magazine is going to be really interested in this project as the fullest expression of all the ideas that you've ever thought about, and those are really different approaches and really different conversations. And so part of my job is to say like, okay, you're talking to, whoever. So really, really, you got to highlight like the client wanted this really complicated thing and you gave it to them and it was really hard, but you did it in this way, versus you're talking to this person and you want to really say like, ever since I was a child, I've been interested in logs. And so, this project is some abstraction of a log in some way that's, and like the clients are incidental.
Yeah.
So it really,
it's a very large space to navigate. And I was wondering if at some point, and if this happened with Saarinen or in other cases you've seen, where the press and the media and the stuff that gets published, while we recognize might be one version of the story, ends up defining the future work of the architect, or ends up defining how the architect thinks about their work or how they approach the work even.
Yeah. I think that's such a good question. And that's sort of like that's the danger of press, is that if you are a sensitive person and you read somebody's description of yourself and what you do written very confidently, I think it can be very destabilizing. I don't know how Tom Kundig feels about his career. I wrote about him like 20 years ago. Tom Kundig of Olsen Kundig, really, really great architect. I'm a big fan. Practiced a lot in Seattle and kind of had this like meteoric rise based on a couple projects. I'm thinking of like Chicken Point Cabin, I'm thinking of The Brain, but basically like Tom Kundig became known for his gizmos, right? Which is the term that he uses. So many of his projects would have some sort of really cool, I'm sure you know all this. This is for people who maybe don't know about Tom Kundig, right? But he would have this sort of like a pulley that would be like a little wheel, and you would turn the wheel and then this like massive door would open the Chicken Point. Or he was sort of very into like gizmos. And so I think for many years, people would hear the name Tom Kundig and they would be like, gizmo, like how fun. And I think that I haven't seen that so much recently. Like I think now there's been a little bit more attention on Jim Olsen. I wrote about Jim Olsen's cabin as well. But Olsen Kundig is really, they're expanding. They have an office in New York. They're really moving into sort of like high-end residential stuff. And I haven't seen Tom Kundig talk about a cool gizmo in a really long time, which I imagine is a very careful decision. I also know his in-house publicist who ended up leaving Olson Kundig after many, many years. And he's very, very good at what he does. And I imagine that he sort of saw like, okay, maybe every journalist is coming in and saying like, cool project, what gizmos were in it? And there might, again, I don't know. I'm purely like hypothesizing, but I know that there was like a lot of gizmo talk, and now there's no gizmo talk. And I imagine that somebody gave some advice in some direction,
It's interesting. I mean, the gizmos are alluring for sure, because if you're anyone in design or construction, like, wow, how did you do that? First of all, if you're
it takes a lot
if you're practicing
work.
architect, how did you find someone to build that for you? And how much did it cost to do?
Oh my God, how much did I know, exactly.
But we did have Tom on the show not long ago, and I don't think I asked him directly about gizmos, but I did ask him, I think we asked him, like, which project started to solidify the approach or dare I say style of that seemed to be consistent. And I forget how he handled the question, but architects hate the word style, I've come to learn.
But I can imagine that having a project being published and having to talk about it to a publicist, someone who's outside of the project, not the client, not fellow architects, probably makes you think about it in ways that you haven't thought about before, and maybe clarify things as a designer a lot more than if you don't get that project published,
Yeah. I mean, I think so I remember it's been interesting to do publicity for two very different books. So my first book was a memoir. It's called How to Be Loved. And it was about really my life, and architecture was completely incidental. And it was about sort of three friends who saved my life in various ways during, a series of harrowing events. And I noticed that, so that was that book. And then this book is a scholarly biography mixed with sort of like a hybrid memoir. And I get asked about ideas now. I get asked about ideas and the way that the world is. And with my last book, I was asked almost exclusively about like what happened. And very briefly, I sort of had a brain hemorrhage, and then that led to a lot of very exciting events. And I was sort of in and out of the hospital for years. It was very exciting. But the questions that I was asked were all about like, okay, well, how did you know? Because like my sister has a weird thing. And like, did you know you were going to have a brain hemorrhage? Or right. Basically, people are like, how do I avoid having a brain hemorrhage? And I was like, well, there was really no warning signs. I was eating a lot of kale and doing a lot of yoga, and my brain exploded. And so it was all about like me as a person. And with this book, it's been really interesting because the questions are like me as an expert mostly, right? Or I mean, our entire conversation, you sort of assumed an expertise in a facility, which like, thank you very much. I hope I have earned it, But you haven't asked me about like how I feel in the morning and what my relationship is like and all these things. Even though both books are about ideas. The first book, I just used my life as a medium to explore certain ideas about like, how do we treat people who are sick? How do we valorize people who are sick? Why do we assume that the sick have this like insight? We sort of were like, oh, well, the wise cancer patient. And like, the cancer patient is just like, man, I really don't enjoy having cancer. I mean, and there is wisdom and there is, freedom and stuff like that. But, so I think what I'm trying to say is like having gone through an experience myself of being on the other side and having people ask me questions and having to learn how to sort of gracefully deflect or redirect or reorient, has given me a lot more sympathy for my clients. And having I used to just send them the story immediately. Like I'd be like, oh my God, look, like you got published. Like I did a good job. I got you in a magazine. Right. And then they would invariably have some sort of complaints. And then I would be like, oh God, like they're complaining. And I finally had to learn it just is a weird feeling to be written about. It's just really weird. And it's probably never going to feel that great. And so I've learned to kind of preface every big project that comes out. I'm like, we've been working towards this for like a year and we have it and it's great. And you're probably going to read it and feel misunderstood or misheard or like they didn't quite get you. And like, we do everything we can to like influence and suggest. And I don't want to say control because we can't control anybody, but like we do what we can. But ultimately, like a writer has their own agenda. They have their own interests. They have their own motivations and body of work. And so, you know, for architects, kind of, I think it's an act of profound bravery and trust to just keep saying, like, here's the thing that I made. And like you were saying, like, say, here's the thing that I made to your parents. And if you have good parents, you get validation. When you say, here's the thing that I made to the world of media, people are like, well, it's not as good as the last thing that you made. And it's certainly not as good as the thing that this other person made. And like, I don't know, it seems like you're kind of like falling down on the job, you know, and you've just spent 7 to 10 years on this project and you're just like, oh, so I think it's like, it takes a strong stomach to kind of put yourself out there, as they say.
Yeah, and it's a very different space from what architects do. One, because I think you mentioned the word control, and I think that's an important and key word, because architects tend to be very, very controlling. And to our defense, we kind of have to be, because we're in charge of all the design and planning before things start happening, and then we oversee or have some oversight over construction during construction. So like control is the name of the game to make sure it's high quality, built properly, you're not wasting money, it's safe, all that kind of stuff. And as soon as you have a creative piece like an article, which is it's a work, it's a project itself, go out there that is packaging and distilling what you created in someone else's words, I can see where that would be a very, very scary and uncomfortable thing in the beginning, at the very least.
Yeah. Well, I love that you point out that control for an architect is necessary. And I think that's like very good for me to hear and be reminded of, because I do sometimes think like, God, you just got to let go. But as an architect, if you let go, somebody's roof is going to collapse, or like you really can't let go as an architect. And this is, I think, part of the profound value of architecture and this sort of, I think, where it's justified to say like, okay, you're building the spaces that people put their bodies into every day. So you really need to know what you're doing. And be really controlling. But you just help me have more sympathy for my clients who are like, you know, sometimes I would say micromanaging, and I'm like, no, but they need to be micromanaging their, you know, 150 unit multifamily project that they're doing. They do need to micromanage that.
Yeah, and it's kind of hard for, I think, architects to know when to turn on that side of the brain and operate that way versus not. Even in their own work, frankly, it's hard to do that.
Right.
So when is the book about Marina is not out yet? It's in pre-order?
It comes out on Tuesday, September 13th.
Okay. Ooh, yeah. I like it. Awesome.
Very close.
Very, very good.
Yeah.
Do you we're almost out of time. I was wondering, when you're talking to architects and you're acting as the publicist, how often is it when they're describing a project to you and that you're thinking, that 99% of what they say is going to be not useful at all in terms of the message being sent, and then you have to dig and try and find that interesting story that to them they never even heard about, that it would be interesting and they happen to mention just by happenstance?
That's such a good question. I would say like 60% of the time I'm pushing and digging, which is why I'm so glad that I was a journalist before doing this, because I know how to push and dig. But I mean, I had an experience recently that I was thinking about where I interviewed my clients and I did a project description, and I thought it was fine. I thought I'd sort of captured the project, and it wasn't one of the best things I've ever written, but you know, I was like, okay, this is good. And I sent it to them, and they were back and they were like, okay, we really hope we're not being rude, but it feels like you've never thought about our work before and we're looking at a different project. And, you know, I took a moment and then I was like, yeah, you know, I thought, well, you know, my ego wanted to sort of push back and be like, well, you know, I wrote it that way for a reason, and you know, whatever, all my like fear defense mechanisms kicked in. And then I just thought, you know, I looked at some pictures. I had a 20-minute phone call. They lived with this project for 5 or 6 years. If they feel really misrepresented, I'm going to give it another shot. Completely rewrote it. And they were like, great, you got it. You know, so sometimes like I'm the person who messes up, right? It's not that like And I have to be sort of open to like, I have a really clear idea. And this was the case where I thought something was really interesting that they didn't. And I had to take a step back and be like, no, I think they actually know what is the really interesting thing at the heart of this project. But often, I mean, I have clients who, I have one client in particular who I really, really like. I consider her a friend. And she just does not have a narrative brain. You know, she's an extraordinary architect, does really, really big projects, really beautiful stuff. But with her, I've learned I just kind of go off, you know, I just make stuff up and I'm like, you know, I look at the images and I send her something and then she corrects it. Because when I would ask her to send me bullet points, I mean, she would just be like, this is a luxury project. And I was like, okay. I was like, what, you know, tell me about the wood slats that are here that are interacting with the light. And she was like, I like wood, you know? So I was just like, okay, I gotta, you know, and thankfully, you know, we have a lot of trust built up and she'll, you know, but it's like some people, I want to give them something that they can correct. I mean, that's another great sort of journalism trick is you purposefully misunderstand somebody so that they then vehemently correct you, which is usually a much better quote, right? So I say, oh, so maybe this project was really about the basement. And they're like, it's not about the basement. It's about the interplay of light and space and the staircase and the central axis. And I'm like, yes.
Yeah.
That's a good tactic.
That's a good tactic.
Yeah. You can use it with clients too. You're like, so yeah, you really want the range hood to be the most expensive thing. And you know, they're like, no, I want the swimming pool. Like, okay.
That's fascinating because some of the kind of the dance or investigation is similar to what we have to do for the show. And we have the benefit of 2 hours pretty often, which is quite a long time. Not.
Sometimes we do have guests who are like the bullet points. You know, it's like you ask a question and it's 2-word answer. And we're like, come on, we got another hour and 45 minutes to go.
We got 2 hours to kill, making me sweat.
That is rough. Yeah.
But it works out in the end. But it is a similar kind of thing over the course of 2 hours of a lot of times trying to uncover or understand the story of the architect when the architect in particular has not pre-rehearsed that story and they're fumbling around. That can be quite challenging, but also rewarding.
Yeah. Well, you're very, very good interviewers, I have to say. So I'm sure that,
You're a very easy interviewee.
Oh, thanks.
Final question. We're at the end here. It's just a fun one. What is your favorite building?
Right. Oh, gosh. Oh, I should have prepared for this. So I clearly don't have one offhand. Now I'm sweating. Now I'm like sweating bullets.
You can name a few.
I mean, the one that comes to mind is like my guy's TWA terminal, you know, like, I just like that building became the sort of touchstone to me when I was living in the Bay Area. I was working on SARN and I would fly to New York and I would just get this glimpse, you know, at JFK. And I was like, one day I'll get back inside that building. And I had dinner with my advisor. I mean, all my relationships to buildings are emotional. So, you know, I just think about like how much time I spent learning about Aero and Aline and how much time I spent thinking about TWA and having dinner with my advisor there, like right in that moment where we had all been vaccinated and Omicron wasn't here yet. And so that's just the building that keeps coming to mind. Like, that's not my like official historical critical stance, which I don't have. So I would say for now, like TWA terminal at JFK really has a piece of my heart.
Nice. Lovely. This was a great conversation. Thank you so much for coming on the show. This was awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for watching this video on YouTube. If you like what we're doing, then please support our show by hitting that subscribe button and liking and commenting on our videos.
You can also find us on most of the social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We're mostly on Instagram. And you can reach out to the hotline, 213-222-6950. You can send a text message or leave a voicemail if you have any reaction to this recording, any questions you might have, or guest suggestion. Feel free to send it our way.
Cool. Thank you for watching and see you next week.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.